I'm meteorologist Peter Chan. Welcome to the Alaska Weather Show on this Saturday, January 14th, 2023. And we try to do this each evening through a unique partnership with Alaska Public Media. If you'd like additional weather information, you can always go online to weather.gov. It'll bring you up to a map of the continental U.S. You point and click, and it'll bring up all sorts of information, forecasts, the latest watches, warnings, or advisories. On the weather map this Saturday afternoon, we're seeing those western storms pull in across the southern half of the Rockies, creating winter storm conditions, winter weather advisories. Still, a couple of storms will be rolling across California into Arizona, southern Nevada as we go through tonight, Sunday, and on Monday. But after that, the pattern should begin to shift. What we are looking at for Alaska is right now, we still have some winds up there along the northwest Arctic coast, along the Chukchi Sea, Point Hope down through Shishmaref, where we're anticipating still some areas of blowing snow. Earlier there were blizzard warnings, but we're going to just call it winter weather advisory at this point because we're not anticipating quite as much in the way of blowing snow and reduced visibility. Now there may be some light snow, inch or two of accumulation across areas of south central, the Kenai Peninsula, and up into the Anchorage Bowl that could possibly change over to a little bit of freezing rain or freezing drizzle later this Saturday night or in the early morning hours there of Sunday. And then we're still waiting for a couple of solar disturbances to arrive that could trigger a minor geomagnetic storm later today and overnight that could lead to enhanced auroras if the sky is clear in your location. But we are, as of today, last quarter moon. And then moderating temperatures look like they'll be happening here the latter half of January and above normal precipitation setting up across the mainland. Let's quick look at a few of the area webcams from the FAA. Point Hope, windy there. They've had wind gusts over 40 miles an hour today, but not that much in the way of blowing snow. So that's one of the reasons the blizzard warning was downgraded a bit to a winter weather advisory. Central Alaska Range, partly cloudy skies, a beautiful image there, and partly cloudy skies, a temperature there at 11 degrees. And then in the Anchorage area, Merrill Field this afternoon, some light snow falling. Anchorage area has picked up about an inch of snowfall. And again, as we go through this evening and overnight, it could possibly change over to a little bit of freezing rain or freezing drizzle. And then finally in the Panhandle, Sitka picking up a few passing light rain showers. Temperatures, Sitka down through Craig and Metlakatla have seen temperatures the past few days in the mid-40s for highs. Well, looking at the current advisories, nothing too terribly significant, just those winter weather advisories along the lower Chukchi Sea coast of the Bering Strait. And then the special weather statement to account for the possibility of that snow changing over or mixing with a little bit of freezing rain or freezing drizzle tonight and early Sunday morning. Well, let's look at the satellite imagery. And as I said yesterday evening, we have a zone, an active weather zone that extends from the lower Gulf across the North Pacific through the Alaska Peninsula, Kodiak Island along the southwest coast and out into the Bering. And this is the area where we find the low pressure systems and some weakening fronts or troughs of low pressure. There also is a trough of low pressure right here along the northwestern coast. There's a high up in the Arctic Ocean that's helping to create those brisk east-northeast winds across areas of the far northwest. And those will likely continue into the day on Sunday, though maybe not quite as strong as what they have been today. So here on the weather map, you can see the series of weaker low pressures from the southeastern Gulf to near Kodiak Island. This other low down here in the North Pacific is going to lift northward into the central Alaska Peninsula on Sunday. Later tonight, early Sunday morning, see the configuration of lows, that active weather zone extending from the eastern Gulf all the way through the Alaska Peninsula and the Aleutians lower Bering Sea. And then for Sunday afternoon, we expect low pressure to be lifting up into the central Alaska Peninsula, a couple of troughs lingering along the west side and southwest parts of the state, just a weak area of high pressure there in the Yukon, with the other low pressure systems extending out north of the central and western Aleutians. And by Monday, not a whole lot of change in the overall pattern. This system here lifting out of the North Pacific will have a little more oomph to it and could bring the next round of precipitation to the Panhandle here Tuesday into Wednesday, later Tuesday into Wednesday. Mainly rain for the outer coastal and southern coastal areas and some light snow up through the north. And as I mentioned, the pattern will begin to slowly change, I think, as we get into next weekend and beyond through the end of the month. But still cold in the far north, many readings below zero. In fact, this Saturday morning, Arctic Village was down to 26 below zero, so many temperatures still sub-zero north of the Alaska Range. Staying near 40 overnight here along the outer Panhandle coast. And then as we go into Sunday afternoon, temperatures will be back up in the lower 40s from, say, Kodiak down to areas along the south and western portion of the Panhandle, still below zero north the slope along the Arctic coast. And then for Monday morning, cold temperatures continue in the far north along the Brooks Range and up through the North Slope and Arctic coast. We'll see readings staying just a bit above freezing along the Gulf Coast coastline there all the way into the Panhandle. And then by the time we get into Monday afternoon, temperatures still below zero, North Slope, Arctic and Northwest coast there. But the interior moderating a bit, back up to about 30 degrees in the Anchorage Bowl here for Monday afternoon and near 40 at Kodiak. And then still some temperatures lower 40s here from Sitka down through Craig and Ketchikan. Well, let's talk about how the pattern is going to be changing as we go through the middle month. Once we get past next weekend, it's looking like what's going to happen down, it's a bigger long wave pattern. The stormy western U.S., the continental U.S., trough's going to push inland, be a little drier out through the western states. So that's going to cool them down and dry them out, but that's going to allow Alaska, the mainland, to moderate. Temperatures are going to warm here as we head through the latter half of the month, especially beyond the 20th. And so what that's going to do is bring systems with some more moisture coming in off the Bering and North Pacific. And so that will lead for the potential of above normal precipitation setting up here in the mainland, especially centered on west central areas. So we'll have to watch that pattern shift because it could bring back some accumulating snows here to these areas. So keep that in mind here as we head toward the end of the month. But otherwise, temperatures should be improving a bit here over the next week or so.
And now, aviation weather around Alaska.
Well, it's now time for your aviation weather, and if you have a flight planned either for Sunday or on Monday, the main weather considerations are going to be this zone of unsettled weather that extends from the Panhandle, the Gulf areas, North Pacific, westward across the Alaska Peninsula, southwest coast, in through the central Bering, past St. Paul and St. Matthew. This is a zone where there are going to be a few different low pressure systems in various stages of weakening, along with some troughs of low pressure or lingering frontal boundaries. IFR is expected Sunday morning along areas of the North Slope, and still some strong winds along the northwest Arctic coast there along the Chukchi Sea coastline. And then as we go into Sunday afternoon, we still see a pocket of IFR up there along the central North Slope. A little more broken up along areas of the Gulf, but hanging in and around Prince William Sound, east side of the Kenai, Kodiak Island, and then still much of the Panhandle in IFR conditions, as well as the southwest coast, Bristol Bay, on up toward the Yukon Delta and up into St. Lawrence Island. For Monday morning, still IFR conditions along and just north of the Brooks Range and through the North Slope, pockets along the Alcan border, as well as the northern Gulf Coast, in through much of the Panhandle, Prince William Sound, even up through the Copper River Basin, east side of Kodiak Island, and then areas of the Alaska Peninsula along Bristol and Kuskokwim Bays through Nunavik Island, back west toward St. Matthew and St. Lawrence. And then for Monday afternoon, maybe some shrinkage there of the IFR conditions to more MVFR across the Gulf, but pockets of IFR north and south Panhandle, still around Prince William Sound, Cordova, pocket there along the Alcan border toward Eagle, and then back up toward a little pocket there at the west end of the Brooks Range. But generally speaking, on Sunday, Aniktuvik as well as Adigan Pass should be MVFR, but as you fly a little further north along the north slope, you'll encounter IFR. Further south and west, the west arm of the Alaska Range, IFR expected there, as will be the case at Rainy Pass. As we round the central Alaska Range, windy, may be able to hold on to MVFR conditions throughout the day Sunday. Also further east toward Isabel, though there will be areas of IFR just to the west and southwest of Isabel Pass. And then finally, further east in the Alaska Range, Mentasta, VFR. And as we drop southwestward, Tanita Pass should generally see IFR conditions holding there on Sunday. And then further south and west, Portage Pass, kind of a split. The eastern half is going to be IFR, especially around Prince William Sound, but the west entrance, generally MVFR conditions should prevail there on Sunday. And then for the far north end of the Panhandle at Chilkoot and White Passes, IFR conditions will rule there during the day Sunday. Freezing levels are the surface freezing line runs from the central Bering between St. Matthew and St. Paul into Bristol Bay along the north end of the Alaska Peninsula, east side of the Kenai, northern Gulf Coast, and then the inner channels, intercoastal mountains there of the Panhandle to British Columbia. Freezing levels aloft do come up slightly to and above 2,000 feet there over the northern and eastern Gulf, including much of the outer Panhandle, Haida Gwaii, and you have to get all the way down almost to Vancouver to get freezing levels aloft around and above 4,000 feet. Greatest threat for icing, a few pockets to look at, generally above 4,000 feet, west end of Prince William Sound, far northeast Kenai Peninsula, areas east side of Kodiak Island and just southwest of there, from just off of the lower Yukon Delta to just south of St. Lawrence Island into the northern Bering Sea, and then an area just south of the eastern half of the Aleutians. That's where we expect there to be some moderate icing potential. Now, winds aloft, the jet core winds at 30,000 feet are going to be strongest in the North Pacific out of the west-northwest, south of the Aleutians and the Alaska Peninsula. So that's well south of the region. But we do have a low circulation central Alaska Peninsula with winds ahead of it out of the southeast into lower Cook Inlet upwards to 65 knots. As we bring things down to 700 millibars, 9,000 feet, we see those winds continuing about 45 knots. More importantly, as we come down to 3,000 feet, winds off of Point Hope, northwestern Arctic coast, anywhere from 40 to 60 knots. That's going to create turbulence issues. And if we take a look at where the greatest threat for turbulence will be from Utqiagvik down to especially around Point Hope, through the Bering Strait to the north side of St. Lawrence, and also an area along around Kodiak Island, the entrance of Cook Inlet, and then further west through the central and western Aleutians, there could be some moderate turbulence, especially surface to 3,000 feet.
We can't just put the fires out because we can't put them out. We've tried that now for a century and it doesn't work. It just makes the next one worse.
You may see a place like this and think, total devastation. And it's not your fault for thinking that.
But that depiction is, as we've learned from countless experts over the last 2 weeks, not the whole story, and not how you should think about wildfires.
The truth is, there are lots of types of habitats out west, and fire affects them all in unique ways. So it's important to start thinking about the big picture with wildland fires. So let's first rewind. To help us understand what's going on out west, Rob and I started calling up the experts, and what we found was that the story of fire, particularly in the west, is complex. So to understand it, we planned a road trip.
Road trip time!
The goal of our road trip was to see as many forests as we could and meet experts around the region to help us understand the role fire plays out here. First destination was to find the forest burned by the now famous Great Fires of 1910. And at the heart of what is known as the Big Blow-Up, the logical first place to stop, the city of Wallace.
Hi, Sarah.
Hi. Good. Haley and I are in this cute town of Wallace, Idaho, which was completely destroyed by the 1910 fires. You can see how much damage this fire actually did. Let's send up the drone and see what the surroundings look like now. What we found was a small town surrounded by a dense forest, with every single tree just over 100 years old.
So everything we see behind us now, that's all new growth since 1910.
And to help us put these historic fires and the forests around Wallace in perspective, We met up with historian Diane Smith.
This is Wallace, and here are your fires.
All of this is the 1910 fires.
This is not that unusual. The fact is, it just was at a time in our development as a country. We noticed it, we paid attention to it, and we got the national attention for it.
Right. As it turns out, these fires helped reinforce the idea at the time that every fire needed to be suppressed at all costs. And this suppression for so long has led to new problems, namely thick forests full of fuel. But don't just take my word for it. Let me show you the difference.
Notice how different this place is than this one that has been thinned out quite heavily in the past, or like an area like this that's been burnt quite frequently.
In fact, both of these areas show how many forests would have looked in the past under regular burns. The dead and low-growing material gets consumed easily by fire, very much unlike this forest, which has had fire suppression for over 100 years and could lead to a high-intensity fire.
And all of this dry, dead material, that's problematic.
So we went looking for a big fire and just followed the smoke.
Oh gosh, a huge crown fire. I gotta get this.
These high-intensity fires aren't great because in many forests they kill all the trees over a large area, even in forests that used to be very resistant to frequent fires. And nobody knows that better than the people that work in this particular forest.
There's green coming back, and I guess I've gotten somewhat used to it, and I still have hope that the entire Sierra Nevadas won't look like this, that we can maybe get ahead of it. So the fires nowadays can move from the surface right into the tree canopies really easily, where in the past, fires would have kept trees pruned, they would have kept fuel densities low, and so now you end up with a lot more high severity fires in the West than had a fire regime kept under its historic recurrence. This to me is more a lesson of fire exclusion and keeping fire out of the system. If we're keeping it out of when it would burn with a beneficial effect, it will burn, and the probability of it burning at an unbeneficial state is higher.
So again, this is where it's complicated. We thought if only we could stop the fires, we'd win the fight. But the fires like the King Fire here show that stopping the fires only made it worse. Add that to the fact that we're living closer than ever to these wild lands. So to help us understand the wildland-urban interface, we met up with CAL FIRE. And as we were pulling up to this neighborhood, one of the residents quickly came out to tell us about the latest fire.
Yeah, our biggest fear is fire. It was very scary. I mean, everybody was honking and get out, and you know, there's a fire.
This is the risk across California. The response piece alone isn't going to solve this challenge if the homeowners aren't organized.
Because we're all in the same boat. One match away from everybody losing everything. It's a real fear.
Literally, we could have that fire spread up in here within a matter of seconds.
Wow.
California is going to have fires. We're not going to stop all the fires in California, so we have to have an infrastructure that's fire resistant. We need to work on policies that help us engage in active management of our forest. That's using prescribed fire as a tool. It's all the things in the toolbox. It's a combination of managing our forest and a combination of protecting our communities that are in them.
If it wasn't complicated enough, this made it very clear that you can't just let the fires burn whenever they start. The forests need to be managed to help mitigate the risk to us. But using fire seems to be one of the keys to making things safer, and knowing the science behind fire is always key to implementing good management.
Fire Sciences Lab, right over here.
So we made a stop at the Missoula Fire Lab to try to understand what we know about fire.
You see the flames at the very top and how they're sticking to the slope?
They really are. Everybody's laying down.
They're laying down. Well, that's flame attachment. Actually a very difficult thing to understand.
Here at the Fire Lab, the scientists study the basics of fire. Understanding the complexities here helps firefighters and forest managers in the field better predict and fight wildland fires.
Fires are inevitable. The only choices that we really have is what kind of fire to have and when do we want it. And that's it. Almost? Ready. You're ready. Jason's ready.
Mark's team is prepping to light a huge bed of precisely cut cardboard.
You're not going to be in any danger. So when the lights go out, don't move. Gasoline.
This is one of many experiments they'll run to understand the physics of fire, how it moves, how it spreads. And all of this measured by precise scientific instruments and high-speed cameras. Tens of thousands of pieces of cardboard up in flames in mere seconds. The ongoing research will help us better understand fire with the ultimate goal that we can live better with it. But can we do that? There is one forest we knew of that seems to have figured out this coexistence with fire, a place where fires burn all summer, every summer. It's part of their way of life and a mentality we wanted to know about. And here we went out with our guides Frank Lake and Steve Valentine, who work with the local U.S. Forest Service and tribe to help keep a healthy forest.
This is perfect. The fire's basically come through and cleared out the understory, and all that's left are the trees.
Yeah, it's black and it's charred, and you just see a few of the earliest sprouts, but you come back in here a year, it's gonna be alive again.
And to many, this may seem destroyed, but they view it differently here.
That fire's medicine, because it's not if it comes, it's when it comes. We need fire, and fire needs us.
You see, fire needs people to remind us how important fire is to the ecosystem. Frank and Steve's ancestors have been burning this forest for millennia. It's now part of what makes the forest special. They just want to make sure that it's not forgotten.
Basically, what you leave behind is what's important.
When they say this is your foods and your medicines, your sacred places, your springs, your water, that's essential, that's who we are as people. We have to learn to live with fire. We have to learn to respect fire. We have to maintain that security. That's why I do what I do.
Haley and I have learned a lot on our journey. We've learned that fire is complicated, and it's not as black and white as we make it out to be, and it is an integral part of our forests. They've had fire running through them for thousands of years, and they will continue to have fire in them in the future. And we can't always put the fires out. We have to decide what kind of fires to live with, and that is why we need to work with these fire crews from around the country. We also need a public who understands the importance of fire on the landscape. A healthy forest, you see, is a forest that lives with fire.
And now, marine weather around Alaska.
Welcome back, and we'll start out looking at the sea ice edge here as we get into our marine weather segment. Extensive ice across the north, the Arctic coast down through the Chukchi Sea and through the Bering Strait. Winds will continue to be brisk northeasterly, especially off of Point Hope, Cape Lisburne, as well as down through the Bering Strait here as we go through the rest of this weekend. There could be some shifting of the ice, even some of the shore-fast ice trying to pull away and creating some little fissures or polynyas that'll try to open up. Further on toward the south, we expect the ice to continue to press slowly westward and a bit southward here with a strong northeasterly flow coming in off of the ice in the land. And that'll be the case here as we go through early next week. But looking at the southeast panhandle, winds are going to be a bit of a mix. Southeast 10-15 knots, Ketchikan up to Petersburg, waves 2-3 feet. North winds 15 knots, Lynn Canal. And outer coast winds will have a westerly component, 10 to 15 knots. South of Gustavus, waves 10 feet, but more of an easterly component to 15 knots. Yakutat westward with 9-foot waves. For Monday, winds continue southeast, 15 knots, the southern half of the inner channels there with waves of 3 feet. North winds 10 knots, Lynn Canal, couple foot waves there north of Juneau. And then for the outer coast, look for southeasterly winds, 15 to 20 knots. South of Gustavus down to off of Craig, but as much as 25 to 30 knots once you get Yakutat westward, and waves running around 10 feet area wide. For the northwestern Gulf, strongest winds will be just northeast of Kodiak Island into the entrance of Cook Inlet to 35 knot easterly winds, creating 10 to 11 foot waves. Winds will be out of the east Prince William Sound at 15 knots with waves of 2 feet, and northeast winds upper Cook Inlet at 15 knots, creating waves 2-3 feet if there's some open water there amongst the ice. And then Monday, winds come down a little bit. Generally, strongest winds will be lower Cook Inlet and off the Kenai and the entrance of Cook Inlet, 25 knots out of the northeast to east. Waves could be as high as 9 to 10 feet there at the entrance of Cook Inlet. And then across Kodiak Island on Sunday, there's going to be a low pressure circulation, so the wind's kind of turning around with some sort of easterly component near 30 knots. Winds from Bristol Bay down to Cold Bay will go northeast and northerly at 15 to 20 knots, with waves on the Bering side 2 to 3 feet, but generally at or above 10 feet in the open waters of the North Pacific and Western Gulf. And then on Monday, we're still seeing a bit of a circulation there, easterly winds to 20 knots around Kodiak Island, but then turning back toward the west, either side of the lower Alaska Peninsula at 15 to 20 knots, waves 2 to 5 feet from Bristol Bay to north of Cold Bay, and generally running about 13 to 15 feet as you get well offshore of the peninsula. And across the Aleutians, eastern Aleutians, a bit of a mixed bag of winds, variable 10-15 knots, but turning more westerly and increasing to 30 knots once you get west of Nikolsky. Waves 18 feet on the North Pacific side, 9 to 12 feet there on the Bering side of the central Aleutians. And then for Monday, overall winds are generally going to be turning back around with some sort of west or northwesterly component, 25 to 30 knots, waves 16, 17 feet on the North Pacific side, and generally maybe 9 to 11 feet there on the Bering side. For the southwest coast, we have some brisk winds coming in off the ice out of the northeast, 25 knots out of Norton Sound, 30 knots between the lower Yukon Delta and St. Lawrence, 25 knots out of the northeast in the vicinity of St. Matthew, where the ice will continue to press further westward and southward. And then on Monday, we see the winds take on a little more northerly component, winds upwards of 40 knots from the lower Yukon Delta up to just south there of St. Lawrence Island. Generally north winds 25 knots there in the vicinity of St. Matthew, with waves where there is still a little water in place upwards of 8 feet. But again, the ice continuing to advance west and southward. Along the Arctic coast Sunday, northeast winds 20 knots, but notice still 40-knot winds there off of Cape Lisburne, Point Hope. And then continuing down through the lower Chukchi Sea, Bering Strait, northeasterly winds around 30 knots. And on Monday, strongest winds will continue lower Chukchi Sea, north-northeast 30 knots, accelerating to 40 knots there on the north side of St. Lawrence Island, while the Arctic coast continues to have east-northeast winds around 20 knots. And the area of low pressure will be crossing the Alaska Peninsula on Sunday afternoon, with other lows extending back out just to the north and west there of the central and western Aleutians.
These forecasts are for planning purposes only. Call 1-800-WX-BRIEF for a formal pre-flight briefing. Always file a flight plan before you go flying. The U.S. Coast Guard Auxiliary urges you to leave a float plan with a friend or the harbor master before you go boating.